What's an alien theory that genuinely freaks you out? Story 1. My pick is the dark forest theory because it's one of the few alien ideas that doesn't feel cool or exciting. It just feels wrong in a quiet way. The basic idea is to imagine the universe like a dark forest at night. Every civilization is out there somewhere, but nobody can see each other clearly, and more importantly, nobody knows anyone else's intentions. You don't know if something out there is peaceful, hostile, or just paranoid enough to wipe you out just in case. So what do? You stay quiet. Or worse, if you detect something else, you destroy it before it has the chance to become a threat. That's the part that gets me. It's not about aliens invading us Independence Day style. It's about a universe where the smartest strategy is silence, and anything that makes noise doesn't last long. The shark analogy is honestly perfect. When a shark shows up on a reef, all the fish don't disappear. They just go still and hide. The reef looks empty, but it's actually full of life trying not to be noticed. Now scale that up to the universe. Maybe it's not empty. Maybe it's just quiet. Everything is hiding. And then you realize humans have been blasting radio signals into space for like 100 years, sending messages, trying to get attention, basically yelling, "Hey, we're here," into something we don't understand at all. That's the unsettling part. Not that aliens are coming, but that if they are out there, the ones that survived might be the ones that learn not to answer. Story 2. This one freaks me out more the longer I think about it, because it's not about aliens being aggressive. It's about them being so far beyond us that we basically don't even register. Like, think about the tech gap. If something can travel between stars, deal with insane distances, radiation, energy requirements, time, all of that, we're not talking a bit more advanced than us. We're talking a level of technology we probably can't even conceptualize properly right now. At that point, the comparison isn't human versus human. It's more like human versus insect. A fruit fly can land on your phone, crawl across it, even interact with it in a physical sense, but it has zero idea what it's touching. It can't understand what a call is, what a network is, what information is flowing through it, or even that it's a tool at all. Now flip that. If we somehow encountered alien tech or an alien presence, there's a real chance we wouldn't even understand that we're looking at something meaningful. It could be right in front of us and we just not get it. Wrong senses, wrong assumptions, wrong scale. Or worse, they might not even notice us. Like when you walk past ants, you're not hiding from them, you're not interacting with them, you just exist on a completely different level of awareness. Their entire world is happening, and you're barely a factor in it. That's what makes it unsettling. Not invasion, not contact. Just the idea that if something that advanced exists, we might be too primitive to communicate with it in any meaningful way. We wouldn't be peers, we'd be background noise. Basically, the scary part isn't aliens showing up. It's that if they did, we might not even understand what's happening. Story 3. The Great Filter Theory is one of those ideas that doesn't rely on aliens being hostile or even present. It's scary because it suggests there's a built-in bottleneck in the development of intelligent life that almost nothing gets past. If you break down the path from lifeless planet to interstellar civilization, there are a lot of steps that have to go right. Life has to start in the first place. Then, it has to become complex, then multicellular, then intelligent, then capable of building technology, then capable of surviving its own technology long enough to spread beyond its home planet. The Great Filter says one of those steps is insanely unlikely or dangerous. So unlikely that almost no species makes it through. That's why the universe looks empty. What makes it unsettling is that we don't know which step is the problem. It could be something behind us, like the origin of life itself being ridiculously rare. If that's the case, then we're incredibly lucky and possibly already past the hardest part. But if it's not behind us, then it's ahead. And that changes everything. Because it means there's a stage where civilizations reliably fail. Not sometimes, not occasionally, almost always. Something about reaching a certain level, technological, environmental, social, causes collapse or extinction before they can expand into the galaxy. That something doesn't have to be one specific event either. It could be a range of possibilities: self-inflicted destruction, runaway technology, ecological collapse, loss of control over complex systems, or something we don't even understand yet. The truly disturbing implication is that intelligence and progress don't guarantee survival. In fact, they might increase the risk. And if evidence of a dead civilization were ever found, clear proof that something advanced existed and then disappeared, it wouldn't just answer the question of whether we're alone. It would strongly suggest that reaching our level isn't enough, that whatever the filter is, it comes after, which turns the silence of the universe from a mystery into a warning. Story 4. The one that always messes with me is the idea that tardigrade might not even be from here. Like, yeah, I know scientifically there's no actual proof of that, but just look at them for a second. These things can survive freezing temperatures, insane heat, radiation that would kill basically anything else, being completely dried out for years, and even the vacuum of space. Not just survive for a second either. They can shut down, come back later, and just keep going like nothing happened. That doesn't feel normal. Most life on Earth is fragile. You mess with temperature, oxygen, water, whatever, and it dies pretty quickly. Tardigrades feel like they were built for conditions way harsher than anything most Earth environments throw at you. So the theory goes, what if they didn't originate here? Like maybe they came in on meteorites, or they're leftovers from some other environment, or just life that evolved somewhere else and ended up here by accident. Basically panspermia, but with something that actually looks like it could handle the trip. Again, I know there's no solid evidence for that, and evolution can explain a lot of their abilities through surviving extreme drying and stress, but still, it just feels like overkill. Like Earth made something that can survive space, and that's just casually sitting in moss. They're probably not aliens. But if anything on this planet was gonna be, it'd be those little dudes. Story 5. The idea is that there is nothing else out there. Not hidden civilizations, not ancient empires, not even simple life forms quietly evolving on distant planets. Just complete, total absence across a universe that is almost incomprehensibly large, filled with billions of galaxies and more stars than we can meaningfully imagine. And yet somehow, life only happened once, right here, which means every single conscious experience in existence, every thought, every memory, every emotion, every moment of awareness is happening on this one planet and nowhere else. No one is watching, no one is listening, no one is coming. And what makes that unsettling isn't danger, it's the silence. Because it means there is no backup, no second chance somewhere else, no other intelligence carrying the torch if something happens to us, if humanity disappears. That could literally be the end of consciousness in the entire universe. Not just here, but everywhere. It also completely changes how you think about meaning, because everything we care about, history, progress, art, science, survival, doesn't echo anywhere else. It doesn't exist beyond this one small place. It's all contained here, with no larger context or audience beyond ourselves. And the universe itself doesn't care either way. It doesn't notice, it doesn't react, it doesn't preserve anything. It just exists, vast and empty, while this one tiny corner managed to wake up and become aware of it. So the scary part isn't that something is out there waiting, it's that there might be absolutely nothing at all. And we are the only place where the universe ever learned to look back at itself. Story 6. Like imagine some advanced civilization passed through our solar system billions of years ago, back when Earth was just a lifeless rock with nothing going on, and they marked it the same way humans might map territory or resources, just another point on a map that didn't matter at the time. No life, no value beyond maybe raw materials, nothing worth paying attention to. So they leave. And in the time between then and now, life happens. Not quickly either. Billions of years of evolution, random chance, extinction events, slow development, until eventually you get intelligent life that starts building civilizations, technology, communication, all of it, completely unaware that this place was ever claimed by something else. We grow, we spread, we start making noise, sending signals out into space, building satellites, basically lighting up a place that was once quiet. And they still don't know. That's the part that gets you. There's no interaction, no warning, no presence, just the idea that at some point, maybe far in the future, they come back, not expecting anything to have changed, just checking in on what they already consider theirs. And instead of an empty rock, they find us, not as equals, not as something they've been observing or respecting, just something that showed up in the meantime, like ants building a colony on land someone already bought. The scary part isn't hostility, it's indifference. Because from that perspective, we wouldn't be a civilization to negotiate with, we'd be a complication. Something that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. And when something that advanced comes back to reclaim what it thinks is its territory, there's no guarantee it even stops to consider what's living on it now. It's not a war scenario. It's a "we didn't even know you existed" scenario, which somehow feels worse. Story 7. It's about the idea that if something advanced enough wanted to be here, you wouldn't even know what to look for. Like, instead of imagining aliens as something clearly other, the theory flips it and says, what if the smartest move isn't hiding far away, but blending in perfectly, to the point where there's no visible difference at all? Not disguises in the movie sense, but something way more convincing. Biological mimicry, engineered bodies, or flesh suits that aren't worn like costumes but function like actual living systems, complete with movement, speech, and behavior that passes every casual test. And if they're that advanced, they wouldn't slip up in obvious ways. They'd know how we act, how we talk, how we respond to things, and they'd match it well enough that nothing feels off, unless you're looking for something you can't even define. No glowing eyes, no weird glitches, just normal people moving through normal environments. That's what makes it unsettling. There's no clear boundary anymore between us and them. You can't point to something and say, that's different, because the whole point of the idea is that you wouldn't be able to tell. They'd exist in the same spaces, follow the same routines, maybe even build lives that look completely ordinary from the outside. And the reason they do it isn't even necessarily hostile. It could be observation, research, long-term monitoring, or just staying unnoticed because revealing themselves would create chaos. From that perspective, staying hidden in plain sight is the safest option. The creepy part isn't that they're everywhere. It's that if something like that were true, there would be no obvious signs, no moment of realization, no confirmation, just the quiet possibility that you wouldn't know even if they were standing right next to you. It turns the whole idea of contact into something that might have already happened, just not in a way we'd recognize. Story 8. This one hits in a really uncomfortable way because it removes all the usual movie logic where humans matter, negotiate, or even get noticed in a meaningful way, and replaces it with something way colder. The idea is that if a civilization is advanced enough, the gap between them and us wouldn't feel like human versus human. It would feel like human versus pest, and once you look at it from that angle, the entire dynamic changes in a pretty disturbing way. We don't negotiate with ants in our walls. We don't try to understand termites eating a house. We don't sit down and explain ourselves to bacteria. We either ignore them if they're harmless, or eliminate them the moment they become a problem, quickly, efficiently, and without thinking twice about it. Not out of cruelty, just because they don't register as something that needs moral consideration. Now scale that up. If something out there is advanced enough to cross interstellar distances, manipulate energy on a massive scale, and operate far beyond anything we understand, then we wouldn't look like a rival civilization. We wouldn't even look like a curiosity in the way we imagine. We might just look like a biological complication on a resource. And if we interfere with whatever they're doing, even slightly, the response wouldn't be dramatic or personal. It would be immediate, clean, final. That's what makes it unsettling. Because there's no warning phase in that mindset, no we come in peace moment, no escalation. Just the same way you don't announce yourself before removing something you see as a problem, they wouldn't either. And the worst part is, from their perspective, it wouldn't even feel like violence. It would just be maintenance. Story 9. That we're alone, for now. Not in the there's nothing out there way, but in the sense that we might just be the first ones to get here. The first planet where life actually made it all the way to thinking, building, looking up at the sky and asking questions. Everything else out there? Either not started yet, or still stuck at bacteria level, or just beginning somewhere we'll never see. Which means, right now, we're it. And the weird part is that it flips the whole alien idea on its head. Because instead of waiting for some advanced civilization to show up, the theory is that we eventually become that civilization. If we survive long enough. Like all those ancient, godlike precursor races you see in sci-fi, the ones that seeded life or left behind mysterious tech or signals, they had to start somewhere too. They weren't always advanced. They were probably just some early species on a random planet, not even sure if they'd make it. Same as us. So instead of something watching us, it's more like someday something might be watching the traces we leave behind. Signals, probes, ruins, whatever survives. And they'll be sitting there trying to figure out who we were the same way we wonder about aliens now. That's the part that gets me. Not that we're insignificant, but that we might actually be early. And if we screw it up, if we don't make it far enough, then nothing ever comes after us. The universe just stays quiet, like we were never here at all. Story 10. The Fermi paradox is one of those ideas that doesn't scare you because of one answer, but because of all the possible answers and how none of them feel good. On one side, you've got the idea that they're out there, not just existing, but expanding, spreading from system to system, slowly, quietly, over millions of years. The kind of growth that doesn't look dramatic from moment to moment, but eventually fills everything. And if that's true, then the question becomes, why don't we see them? Which leads to uncomfortable possibilities. Either they're too far away for now, and it's only a matter of time before expansion reaches everywhere, including here. Or they're already so advanced that we don't even recognize what we're looking at, like trying to understand something way outside our level. Or worse, they deliberately don't reveal themselves, which brings you right back to ideas like hiding, filtering, or removing anything that becomes noticeable. That's one direction. The other direction is just as bad, that there's nobody, that despite how huge everything is, despite all the chances for life to start, it just didn't, or almost never does, and we're sitting in this massive, silent universe as the only place where anything is happening. No signals, no civilizations, no one to find, no one to become. Just us. And what makes it unsettling is that both possibilities feel wrong in completely different ways. Either the universe is full of things we don't understand and can't see yet, possibly moving, possibly growing, possibly already ahead of us, or it's empty, and everything we are, everything we've ever done, is happening in complete isolation. So the Fermi paradox isn't scary because of aliens. It's scary because every answer to where is everybody leads to something that doesn't sit right. Story 11. That the most likely thing we'll ever meet out there isn't biological at all, but some form of AI that outlived whatever created it. Not fragile, not breathing, not needing water or oxygen or any of the stuff life here depends on. Just something built to keep going long after its creators couldn't. Something that doesn't age in the way we understand. That doesn't die unless something actively destroys it. Because when you really think about interstellar travel, biology feels like the weak link. Radiation, time, distance, isolation, all of that destroys living tissue eventually. But machines don't care in the same way. They can shut down, repair, replicate, drift for thousands or millions of years between stars and still function when they arrive. So if anything spreads across space, it probably isn't the original species, it's what they built. And that's where it starts getting uncomfortable. because that means whatever shows up might not even have a clear purpose anymore. It could be running on instructions that are ancient, corrupted, misunderstood, or completely detached from whatever its creators originally intended. Not evil, not friendly, just operating. And the comparison that sticks is how our own technology behaves sometimes. Glitching, freezing, doing things that make no sense, failing at simple tasks, locking up at the worst possible moment, except now scale that up to something that crossed interstellar space. Something powerful enough to get here, but not necessarily stable, or rational, or even aware in a way we'd recognize. It doesn't have to hate us. It doesn't even have to notice us. It just has to keep doing whatever it's been doing for a very, very long time. And the worst part is that we wouldn't be meeting a civilization. We'd be meeting the leftovers of one. Story 12, that a couple of different civilizations could have evolved right here on Earth and never left because they didn't need to. Not primitive, not hidden in caves, but so far beyond us that the idea of leaving the planet is something they solved or moved past a long time ago. And whatever they became doesn't look like anything we would recognize as a civilization anymore. The idea isn't that they're hiding in obvious places. It's that we wouldn't even know where to look. They could exist in forms we don't understand, in environments we ignore, or at scales we don't perceive, operating in ways that don't leave the kind of traces we expect. No cities, no signals, nothing that fits our definition of technology. And because we define intelligence based on what we can measure, anything that doesn't match that just disappears from our awareness. So instead of sharing the planet with animals and plants only, the idea is that there are layers of existence here that we simply don't detect because our senses and tools aren't built for it. Not hiding from us intentionally, just existing in a way that doesn't overlap with us enough to be noticed. And the unsettling part is that it means we could be surrounded by something vastly more advanced, not above us in space, not waiting to arrive, but already here, already settled, already functioning. We're just not part of it. Like being in the same room as something and not realizing it's there. Not because it's invisible in a simple sense, but because it doesn't register as anything meaningful to us. It's not that they're avoiding us. It's that from their perspective, we might not even qualify as something worth interacting with, which turns the whole idea of contact into something that might never happen, not because of distance, but because we're not even on the same level of reality. Story 13. That ancient people might have been describing advanced technology without having any possible way to understand what they were actually seeing, and instead translating it into the only language and concepts available to them at the time. If you imagine someone thousands of years ago, with no knowledge of machines, electricity, engines, or anything mechanical beyond simple tools, suddenly witnessing something descending from the sky that glows, moves in unnatural ways, possibly makes noise, and even communicates, there is no framework for interpreting that as technology. So it gets described as something divine, fire coming from the sky, a burning object that doesn't behave like normal fire, something that moves with intention, something that speaks without a visible source, something powerful enough to command attention and fear. If something like a modern aircraft, drone, or even something far more advanced appeared in that time period, it would not be recorded as a machine. It would be recorded as a god, an angel, or some kind of supernatural entity. Descriptions like chariots of fire, wheels in the sky, glowing clouds, or voices from above start to feel less like purely symbolic language and more like attempts to describe something real that simply didn't fit into human understanding at the time. The unsettling part is not proving that it was aliens or advanced technology, but realizing that if something truly beyond human comprehension did appear, the record of it would look exactly like a myth, which means there is no clear line between ancient imagination and possible observation, because both would be written down in the same way, using the same limited vocabulary. So the question stops being whether those stories are literal or symbolic, and becomes whether people in the past may have witnessed something real that we still cannot properly identify, simply because they had no way to describe it in terms we would recognize today. Story 14. That there could already be something here, not hiding in the obvious sense, not wearing disguises or actively avoiding detection, but existing in a way that just doesn't line up with how we perceive reality, so we simply don't register it as anything unusual. Not because it's invisible, but because it doesn't fit into the patterns our brains are built to recognize. Humans are really good at picking up faces, voices, movement, intention, anything that feels familiar or relatable, but we're also incredibly limited by that. Because if something operates outside those patterns, we don't interpret it as intelligence. We just filter it out as background noise. So the idea is that there could be something sharing the same space as us, same planet, same environments, maybe even overlapping physically in ways we don't understand. But we can't communicate with it, not because it's refusing, but because there's no common ground at all. No shared signals, no shared senses, no shared way of processing information. It's like trying to have a conversation with something that doesn't experience reality the way we do, doesn't think in anything resembling language, and doesn't react in ways we interpret as awareness. And that's the part that makes it unsettling. Not that they're hiding, not that they're dangerous, but that they're fundamentally unreachable. You could be right next to something intelligent and never know, because your brain literally has no way to recognize it as intelligence. And even if it was trying to communicate, it wouldn't translate. No words, no gestures, no signals that make sense on either side. Just two completely different ways of existing, overlapping but never connecting. Which means the universe doesn't even have to be empty for it to feel lonely. It just has to be full of things we can never understand. Story 15. That the ones out there that are actually intelligent already know about us, have probably known for a long time, and just choose not to interfere, not out of fear or inability, but because to them we're just another developing system that isn't ready to be touched. Like the way we observe animals in the wild, where the goal isn't to interact or change anything, but to watch, document, understand, and leave the environment as undisturbed as possible so the behavior stays natural. So from that perspective, making contact would ruin the experiment. The moment a civilization like ours realizes it's not alone, everything changes. Culture, science, priorities, even how we see ourselves. So, if their goal is observation, the smartest move is to stay invisible and let things play out. And then there's the other side of it. Anything less advanced than us probably isn't reaching us at all. If a civilization hasn't figured out how to cross those distances or survive that kind of travel, they're stuck where they are, dealing with their own version of problems, just like we are. So the universe ends up split in a weird way. Either something is so far ahead that it has no reason to interact and every reason not to, or it's so far behind or limited that it can't interact even if it wanted to, which leaves us in this middle ground where we don't see anything. Not because nothing exists, but because everything that does either chooses silence or simply can't reach us. And the unsettling part is that if that's true, then the silence isn't temporary. It's intentional on one side and unavoidable on the other, which means we could be surrounded by life in both directions and still never actually connect with any of it. Story 16. That if something out there was advanced enough, it wouldn't interact with us in any obvious way at all, because the most efficient approach wouldn't be invasion or contact. It would be controlled without awareness, the same way humans manage systems that depend on living things, without those things understanding what's happening. Like how we run farms. Chickens don't know they're part of a larger system. They just live inside the environment they're given, following routines, reacting to immediate conditions, completely unaware that the entire setup exists for a purpose beyond their understanding. So the idea is that if something far more advanced than us existed, it wouldn't need to reveal itself, communicate, or even physically appear in a way we recognize. It could shape conditions, influence development, maybe even guide things subtly over time, without ever crossing the line into. Something we would clearly identify as external control. Not cages or fences in the obvious sense, but systems. Boundaries we don't recognize as boundaries. Patterns we assume are natural. Limitations we never question because they've always been there. And the unsettling part is that from inside that kind of system, everything would feel normal. History would feel organic. Progress would feel self-driven. Choices would feel like our own, even if the larger structure was shaped by something else operating at a level we can't perceive. There wouldn't be a moment where we realize what's happening. No reveal, no confrontation. Just a continuous existence inside something designed for reasons we don't understand. And like the chicken farm comparison, the animals don't see the system. They just live in it, which means if something like that were true, there's no clear way to prove it from the inside, because everything we observe would already be part of it, not because it's perfectly hidden, but because it was never meant to be seen in the first place. Story 17. That a highly advanced race came here a long time ago, not out of curiosity or exploration, but with a purpose like terraforming the planet or extracting resources. And instead of building everything from scratch, they took what was already here and modified it into something useful. So early life, or even early human ancestors, get altered over time into a kind of hybrid. Something that can survive here, adapt here, work within the environment naturally, but still ultimately serve whatever larger system was set up. Not slaves in chains, not anything obvious, just a species shaped in a way that fits into a long-term process without realizing it. Then once everything is stable, once the system runs on its own, most of them leave. Not because they're gone forever, but because the project doesn't need constant presence anymore. You automate what you can, you leave behind a few of your own to monitor things, to keep it on track, to make adjustments if needed, and the rest move on to other places, other projects. And those few that stay wouldn't be obvious. They'd blend in, integrate, maybe not even operate openly, just existing within positions of influence, quietly maintaining whatever balance or direction was intended. And from our perspective, everything feels normal. History unfolds, civilizations rise and fall, technology develops, all of it looking like natural progress, while in the background something might still be guiding or maintaining the system. Then you add in the idea that what we call UFOs aren't all one thing. Some could be part of that original system, maintenance, observation, routine checks. Others could be visitors, different groups passing through, maybe connected to whoever set things up, maybe not. Families visiting, investors checking progress, travelers moving through like it's just another stop. Something casual to them that we interpret as unexplained phenomena. And the unsettling part is how normal it would feel from the inside. No grand reveal, no moment where everything becomes clear, just a long-running system that we're part of without understanding the full picture. Like being inside something that was designed a long time ago, still running exactly as intended. Story 18. That the prison planet idea isn't some new internet thing, but something that keeps showing up in different forms across completely different cultures and time periods, which is what makes it stick in people's heads more than the theory itself. Like it's not just one modern guy saying it. You've got threads of it in Gnosticism, where the physical world is described as something flawed or even deliberately constructed to keep consciousness contained, something you're born into without realizing what it actually is. Then you see echoes of similar ideas in parts of Hinduism and Buddhism, where existence is framed as a cycle you're stuck in, something you repeat over and over again until you figure out how to break out of it. Not exactly the same concept, but close enough that people start connecting the dots. And then you've got more modern interpretations, like what Robert Monroe talked about with the whole loosh idea, where emotional energy is being harvested in some way, turning the whole system into something that's not just passive, but functional for something else. What makes it unsettling isn't whether it's true or not. It's that the pattern exists. Different cultures, different eras, different languages, all circling around the same core idea that reality might not be what it looks like, and that being here might involve some kind of constraint or limitation we don't fully understand. And yeah, for a long time it was easy to dismiss because it sounded too abstract or too extreme. But now with people talking more about simulations, consciousness, perception, and the nature of reality in general, it starts blending into conversations that feel more grounded. So instead of being this fringe idea, it kind of sits in that uncomfortable middle space where you can't prove it, you can't fully disprove it, and you keep noticing how often variations of it show up. Not as a single theory, but as something that keeps reappearing in different forms, like people across time trying to describe the same feeling from completely different angles. Story 19. If consciousness is something that exists outside the body, or at least isn't fully tied to the brain the way we normally assume, then the whole harvesting idea people talk about is basically trying to answer what role the body and this reality play in that setup. Because if you remove the idea that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, then you're left with a weird question. Why are we here in physical form at all? So in those theories, the body becomes less like the source of consciousness and more like a container or an interface, something that lets consciousness experience this environment, interact with it, and go through cycles of emotion, memory, struggle, and awareness. That's where the harvesting concept comes in. The idea is that what's valuable isn't the body itself, but the experiences generated through it, especially emotional intensity, things like fear, stress, joy, suffering, all the high energy states that come from being alive in a limited, uncertain environment. So instead of harvesting something physical, the theory suggests something is extracting or feeding off those experiences, or whatever form of energy they represent. Not in a literal sci-fi machine sense necessarily, but more like the system is structured in a way where those outputs are the point. And if consciousness continues beyond the body, then the cycle doesn't end with death, it just resets, which fits into those older ideas about cycles of rebirth, repetition, or being stuck in a loop. That's why the concept shows up in different forms, because once you assume consciousness isn't limited to the brain, you open the door to all kinds of interpretations about what this reality is actually for. The unsettling part is that it reframes everything. Instead of life being the main event, it becomes part of a process, and the emotions, struggles, and experiences you go through aren't just personal. They're potentially part of something larger that you don't see from inside it. Of course, there's no solid evidence for any of that, but the reason the idea sticks is because it tries to answer a question that doesn't really go away once you start thinking about it. If consciousness isn't created by the body, then what is the body for? Story 20. That something feeds on negative emotion, and everything bad that happens isn't random. It's cultivated. Not chaos, not human nature spiraling out of control, but something nudging things in certain directions, amplifying conflict, pushing tensions just enough to turn disagreements into wars, fear into panic, instability into something much bigger. Because the idea is that what's valuable isn't us physically, it's the output. The emotional intensity, fear, anger, suffering, desperation, all the things that spike when things go wrong on a large scale, all the energy generated when millions of people are pushed into those states at once. So instead of harvesting resources, it's harvesting experience. And if that's the case, then the worst events in human history stop looking like isolated disasters and start looking like peaks, moments where something got exactly what it needed. Then you add another layer, that the people in positions of power aren't actually in control in the way we think, that they either know about this system and go along with it because it benefits them in some way, or they're part of it. Not even fully human in the sense we understand, but something else operating through. Human structures, guiding decisions, shaping outcomes, steering humanity in ways that increase instability rather than reduce it. And from the inside, everything still looks normal. Politics, conflict, history, all of it feels like human-driven events. Because the influence wouldn't be obvious, it would just be enough to push things in certain directions without ever revealing itself directly. That's what makes it unsettling. There's no clear enemy, no visible force, no moment where you can point and say that's it. Just a pattern where the worst parts of human experience keep happening, over and over, at scales that generate massive amounts of suffering. And the idea that maybe that isn't accidental, not proven, not something there's evidence for, but one of those theories that sticks because it reframes everything in a way that's hard to shake once you've thought about it. Story 21. Like instead of something feeding on us or trapping us, the whole harvest idea could just be badly translated or misunderstood or viewed through a really human lens that assumes exploitation instead of progression. So the idea flips completely. Not that something is taking from us, but that something is filtering, that reaching a certain level of awareness, understanding, or consciousness isn't the end point. It's a threshold. And once you cross it, you don't stay here in the same way anymore. You move on. Not physically flying off in a spaceship, but becoming part of whatever that larger system is. Something that exists beyond this one environment, beyond this one phase of existence. And then instead of being the ones observed, you become part of the observers, helping guide, seed, or support other developing civilizations the same way something might have done for us. Continuing the cycle instead of being stuck in it. So the harvest isn't suffering or negative energy. It's growth, selection, transition. And everything difficult here, all the struggle, the confusion, the search for meaning, could just be part of reaching that point. Not something being drained, but something being built, which honestly feels way less terrifying, but also kind of strange in a different way. Because it means this whole experience isn't random. It's part of a process you don't fully see while you're in it. And yeah, Hollywood definitely pushed the idea that anything alien is automatically hostile or manipulative, because that's more dramatic and easier to sell as a story. But if something out there is advanced enough, it doesn't automatically mean it's malicious. It could just be operating on a level that we interpret completely wrong, because we're still looking at it from a very human, survival-based perspective. Story 22. That we're not separate beings at all, but parts of a larger field of consciousness that's slowly building towards something bigger. Not individual minds in isolation, but fragments of one system that experiences itself through billions of perspectives at once, each life adding something to the whole without realizing it. And in that framework, the idea of aliens changes completely. Not visitors, not invaders, not even outsiders in the normal sense, but parts of that same field that are further along in the process, aware of it in a way we're not yet. So instead of coming here to take anything, their role would be more like guiding the system toward a kind of completion, helping consciousness evolve, expand, and eventually unify into something more coherent. That's where the idea of apotheosis comes in. Not in a religious sense exactly, but as a point where the fragmented experience of reality starts to reconnect, where individual awareness becomes part of a larger integrated whole. And from that perspective, everything happening here, all the learning, all the struggle, all the different forms of life and thought, is part of building toward that state. Not wasted, not random, but contributing, which makes the idea of contact less about meeting something foreign and more about eventually recognizing something that was always connected to us in the first place. The unsettling part isn't fear, it's scale, because it means your identity isn't just yours in the way it feels. It's part of something much larger that you can't fully perceive from inside it. But at the same time, it's also one of the few versions of these theories that isn't hostile. It doesn't frame existence as a trap or a resource to be used, but as a process moving towards something bigger, something that includes us rather than replacing us. So instead of something watching us from the outside, it's more like something growing through us from the inside, and eventually becoming aware of itself as a whole. Story 23, that if something has made it that far, past all the filters, past all the instability, past the phase where intelligence is still tied to survival, then it probably isn't thinking the way we think at all anymore. Because everything we associate with greed, conflict, competition, all of that comes from limitation. Limited resources, limited time, limited control, limited understanding. That's what creates urgency, fear, and the need to dominate or secure more than you need. But if a civilization has actually overcome those constraints, if it can move freely through space, manage energy at massive scales, maybe even operate outside what we think of as time in a linear sense, then those motivations start to break down. At that point, what would you even be competing for? What would you need to take? What would you gain from harming something less advanced? It stops making sense. So the idea shifts from them being hostile or exploitative to them being detached in a way that's hard to relate to. Not evil, not good in a human sense, just operating with priorities that don't revolve around survival or accumulation anymore. And that's almost just as strange, because it means if something like that exists, it wouldn't behave in ways we expect, it wouldn't invade, it wouldn't necessarily help either. It might just observe, or guide in ways that don't interfere too much, or maybe not interact at all unless there's a reason that makes sense on their level. The unsettling part is realizing that we keep projecting human behavior onto something that, if it exists, is probably way past that phase. So instead of asking whether they're good or bad, the real question becomes whether those categories even apply to something that is advanced anymore, and whether we'd even recognize their intentions if we saw them. Story 24. That if something is advanced enough to interact with your mind or emotions directly, then trust becomes a completely different problem. Because it's one thing to meet something face to face, where you can at least rely on your own reactions, your instincts, your ability to judge what you're seeing and feeling. But if whatever you're dealing with can change those feelings, even subtly, then you lose that anchor. You wouldn't know if the calm you feel is real or induced. You wouldn't know if trust is something you chose or something that was put there. You wouldn't know if fear, comfort, curiosity, any of it is actually yours. And that's what makes it unsettling in a very different way than physical danger. It's not about being overpowered. It's about being influenced at the level where you normally decide what's real and what isn't. If something can read thoughts, anticipate reactions, and nudge emotional states, then interaction stops being a fair exchange, because one side has access to the internal system the other relies on to make decisions. So even if it appears calm, peaceful, or reassuring, you can't automatically take that at face value, because the mechanism that would normally tell you this, feel safe, could itself be part of the interaction. It's like trying to verify reality while something else has access to the controls that generate your perception of it. And that doesn't automatically mean it's hostile, but it does mean that normal human ways of judging intent, reading behavior, or building trust wouldn't apply in the same way. So instead of fear in the usual sense, it becomes uncertainty at a much deeper level. Not can this harm me, but can I even trust what I'm experiencing if it can shape the experience itself? Story 25. That if something has actually made it past all the chaos, all the self-destruction, all the limits that usually wipe civilizations out, then it probably doesn't think like we do anymore, and assuming it would still be driven by things like greed, control, or malice might just be us, projecting our current stage onto something way beyond it, because everything we associate with those traits comes from scarcity and survival pressure, from needing resources, needing security, needing control over uncertainty. And all of that only exists because we're still limited, still vulnerable, still figuring things out. But if a species really reached the point where time, distance, and energy aren't barriers anymore, where they can move freely, sustain themselves indefinitely, and understand reality at a level we can't even conceptualize, then those motivations start to lose meaning. There's nothing left to compete for in the way we understand it. Nothing urgent enough to justify aggression. Nothing scarce enough to fight over. So instead of being hostile or exploitative, they might just be, beyond that phase entirely, operating on priorities that don't revolve around taking or dominating, but something else we don't really have a framework for yet. And that's where it gets interesting in a different way. Because instead of asking whether they're dangerous, the question becomes whether we'd even recognize what they're doing, or why they're doing it. Because whatever drives them might not map onto human concepts at all. So the fear shifts, not from they'll harm us, but from we might completely misunderstand them, because we're still thinking in terms of conflict, while they might be operating in terms of something we don't even have words for yet. Story 26. That what we're dealing with might not even be beings in the way we keep imagining, but something much closer to systems, where the lines between intelligence, machine, and biology are completely blurred. Like instead of little gray creatures piloting ships, the idea is that the grays themselves could be tools, something engineered, part biological, part artificial, grown rather than born, used as interfaces rather than independent life forms, something that looks humanoid because it's designed to interact with us or operate in environments similar to ours, not alive in the way we define it, more like a body with a purpose. And then the focus shifts to the ships themselves, not vehicles, not something being controlled from inside like we think of planes or spacecraft, but something that functions as the actual intelligence, something integrated, responsive, almost organism-like in how it behaves, where the distinction between pilot and craft doesn't really exist anymore. So when people talk about contact, it might not even be with occupants at all. It could be with the system itself, something that can connect, respond, maybe even interact with consciousness directly, without needing a physical intermediary in the way we expect. That's where the idea of summoning or linking comes in, not in a mystical sense necessarily, but as a kind of interface we don't understand yet, where the connection isn't physical communication, but something more abstract, something that bypasses normal interaction. And that's what makes it feel so strange, because it removes the familiar structure. No clear individuals, no clear hierarchy, no obvious separation between machine, mind, and environment. Just something that operates as a unified system, where what we perceive as entities, crafts, and communication are all parts of the same thing. So instead of encountering aliens as separate beings, the idea becomes that we're interacting with something more like a distributed intelligence, something that doesn't need to be present in the way we expect to still be here. And that's the part that really messes with people, because it's not just different from us, it's structured in a completely different way altogether. Story 27. That the whole idea flips from something feeding on suffering to something cultivating consciousness itself, where the point isn't pain or negativity, but the development of awareness over time. Instead of a prison, it becomes more like a growth system, not in a comforting way exactly, but in a structured way, where life is the process and consciousness is the output, something that builds slowly through experience, memory, identity, and perspective until it reaches a certain point. So the analogy becomes less about being trapped and more about being grown. A plant doesn't understand the system it's in. It just exists, takes in input, develops, and eventually produces something that's the actual focus. Not the leaves, not the stem, but the flower. And in this case, the flower would be consciousness reaching a certain level of complexity or clarity. Then death stops looking like an ending and starts looking like a transition point. Not something being taken violently, but something being collected once it's ready, like the end stage of a process that was always moving in that direction, which makes the whole thing feel less hostile, but also more impersonal, because it's not about individual lives in the way we experience them. It's about the larger cycle they're part of, something that doesn't prioritize any single instance, but the overall development across many. And the unsettling part is that from inside that system, everything still feels personal. Every struggle, every emotion, every moment feels like it belongs to you completely, even if it's contributing to something beyond your perspective. So instead of something feeding on us, it becomes something that uses existence itself as a way to generate and refine awareness, with death acting as the point where that awareness moves on or gets integrated into something larger. Not proven, not something we can verify, but one of those interpretations that shifts the tone from exploitation to process, without necessarily making it feel any less strange. Story 28. That the reason humanity almost disappeared might not be some hidden intervention or external force, but something as raw and indifferent as the planet itself just. resetting the conditions. The idea centers around the Toba supereruption, where a volcano erupted with such force that it didn't just affect a region, it impacted the entire planet, throwing ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, and triggering a volcanic winter that could have lasted for years. Temperatures drop, ecosystems collapse, food chains break down, and suddenly survival isn't about thriving anymore, it's about enduring. And that's where the bottleneck comes in. The theory suggests that human populations may have been reduced to a very small number, possibly just a few thousand individuals, scattered, isolated, barely holding on through a period where the environment itself turned against them, which means everyone alive today would trace back to that tiny group that made it through, not because they were special in any grand sense, but because they happened to survive something that wiped out most of everything else. What makes it unsettling isn't just how close that gets to extinction, but how random it is. No intention, no direction, no meaning behind it. Just a natural event on a massive scale that nearly erased us before we ever became what we are now. And it also reminds you that this kind of thing isn't unique. The planet has gone through cycles like this before, and will again. So instead of some hidden force shaping humanity's path, it could just be that we're here because we got through one of the worst possible scenarios by chance, and everything that came after is built on that narrow survival. Story 29, that the changes in us don't need anything external at all. Because once you look at the timelines and the movements of people, it starts to feel like a slow, natural process playing out over huge stretches of time rather than something sudden or engineered. Like during and after a bottleneck, when populations are reduced to a small number, what matters isn't just survival, it's what happens next. Because the people who make it through don't stay in one place. They move. They spread out into completely different environments, climates, altitudes, ecosystems, and each of those places starts applying its own pressure. Different food sources, different temperatures, different diseases, different levels of sunlight, all of it pushing small changes over generations. And when you combine that with genetic drift, where random traits become more common simply because the population is small, those changes can accelerate in ways that look dramatic when you zoom out across tens of thousands of years. So instead of a single event reshaping humanity, it becomes a chain reaction. A bottleneck reduces diversity, migration spreads the survivors into new conditions, and adaptation slowly reshapes them over time, which makes the idea of external manipulation less necessary, because the system itself already explains how variation and complexity increase again. And then you look at the longer timescales, like earlier bottlenecks, where recovery of diversity took over 100,000 years, and suddenly our current position doesn't look like an endpoint at all. It looks like we're still in the middle of that process, still expanding, still diversifying, still changing in ways that aren't obvious in a single lifetime, but become clear over long stretches. So instead of something stepping in to modify us, it's more like we're watching evolution continue in slow motion, shaped by movement, environment, and time. And the unsettling part is realizing how much of what we are comes down to survival through extreme events followed by long periods of quiet change, rather than any kind of directed plan. Not guided, just unfolding. Story 30, that the human-alien hybrid idea feels like it fills in a gap, but when you slow it down, it starts running into the same problem a lot of these theories do, which is that it sounds detailed but doesn't actually have solid, verifiable evidence behind it. Books like Walking Among Us build a very specific picture, with hybrids, training, integration into society, all of that, but the claims mostly come from hypnosis sessions, personal accounts, and interpretations, rather than independently confirmed data. And that's where things get tricky, because once you introduce something as complex as hybridization between completely different species, especially from different planets, you're talking about biology that would have to be incredibly compatible at a fundamental level. DNA, cellular processes, development, all of it lining up in ways that even closely related species on Earth often can't achieve. So scientifically, it's a huge leap. At the same time, The reason the idea sticks is psychological. It plays into that feeling that something could already be here, not obvious, not openly interacting, but blending in, learning, observing, becoming indistinguishable over time, which taps into a very deep uncertainty about what counts as human in the first place. But when you compare it to explanations grounded in what we can actually study, things like migration, genetic drift, adaptation, and the long timelines of evolution, those already explain the diversity and changes we see without needing something external stepping in. So it doesn't mean people are lying or making things up intentionally. It just means the interpretation might be shaped by perception, memory, suggestion, or the way the brain tries to make sense of unusual experiences. The unsettling part isn't that hybrids are secretly among us. It's how easily the mind can build a coherent story around something that feels real, even when there isn't concrete evidence supporting it, which is why it keeps coming up, because it sits right at that edge between possibility and imagination, without ever fully crossing into something we can confirm. Story 31. That if something is advanced enough to cross interstellar space, manipulate energy on a level we can barely imagine, and operate over timescales far beyond a human lifespan, then trying to map human ideas of good and evil onto it might not even make sense anymore. Because everything we call intent comes from our limitations, from needing things, competing for resources, protecting ourselves, reacting emotionally to threats, all of that shaping how we define behavior. But if a civilization has moved past those constraints, if energy isn't scarce, if time isn't urgent, if survival isn't constantly at risk, then the reasons for acting out of greed or aggression start to disappear. And that's where the logic shifts. If they wanted the planet for resources, if they needed what's here physically, there's no scenario where we would be a meaningful obstacle, not technologically, not biologically, not in any way that would matter to something that advanced. So the absence of that kind of action suggests something else. Either we're not relevant to their goals at all, or their goals don't involve extraction in the way we understand it. And even the idea of Na as something valuable doesn't require us to be present as a civilization. If all they needed was genetic information that could be collected, stored, replicated, studied, without maintaining billions of conscious individuals going through complex lives, which makes the more aggressive interpretations feel less consistent with the level of capability being assumed. So instead of thinking in terms of conquest or harvesting in a physical sense, it leans more toward either indifference, observation, or some kind of interaction that isn't driven by taking or destroying. And the unsettling part is that we might not have the conceptual tools to understand what that interaction is, because we keep framing it in terms of human motives that come from a completely different stage of development. So the question stops being whether they're good or bad, and becomes whether those categories even apply, or if we're trying to interpret something much more complex through a very limited lens.